So this is probably the best episode of Ice Queendom thus far. There's plenty of things to love about the show, but this episode contains some of the best moments. It's not perfect, as there's one major flaw, but I'll touch on that in a moment. For now, if you have not started watching the series and have been waiting to binge it, I definitely encourage you to do so at this point in time. But before we get into the events of the episode, I will say spoiler warning for those who have not seen episode 11 of Ice Queendom. I won't be showing the episode or any clips from it in this video, simply images of the episode and analyzing the events that take place. I'll leave links in the description below to Rooster Teeth First and Crunchyroll so you guys can go and watch the series there and support this amazing show. Now, the episode starts off as Weiss's kingdom is being consumed by flames. The purple flames symbolizing Blake's nightmare. And it seems that Blake's nightmare is beginning to overtake Weiss's nightmare. We see that the Faunus are pretty much unanimously overtaking the soldiers of Weiss's kingdom, all except for Big Nicholas, which is causing the largest problem for not only the Faunus, but also Yang. And I suppose the Arma Gigas is also posing a little bit of a problem, but that is being fought by Jean, Pyrrha, and the remaining 5 tiny Weisses. Jean tries to pick up the massive sword, but it's still too heavy for him, so he drops it, and the Arma Gigas happens to step on it. And then its leg disintegrates and it falls to the ground, because the sword, as we know, is a ward against the nightmare. And with the Arma Gigas being born from the nightmare, it can't touch the blade of the sword. Even though just 2 episodes ago, it did pick up the sword by the hilts and toss it off the train like a toothpick without any detriment whatsoever, apparently it's only the blade of the sword that is actually the ward against the nightmare. Which I kind of understand what they were going for, but that's a little bit too convenient for my liking, because the way that swords are forged is that the metal of the blade actually travels into the hilt. So even if they just wanted to say that, oh, it's just the blade, it should be the hilt of the sword as well. And so that doesn't really fit, but, you know, dream logic, so it's understandable in this situation. And then we cut back over to the fight between Weiss and Blake, where Weiss is saying that she doesn't actually want to fight the Faunus, and Blake pretty much turns those words right around on her by saying, oh, you know, like, we didn't mean to hurt anyone. The Schnee's actions weren't specifically against the Faunus, but, you know, just happenstance that the Faunus were oppressed because of the Schnee Dust Company. And Blake goes on about her hatred towards the Schnee Dust Company, that the Schnee Dust Company doesn't even see the Faunus as someone worth hating, that they couldn't even fight back. And this, to me, is symbolized by how Blake's hatred is overtaking Weiss's distrust of the Faunus. Because Weiss doesn't actually hate the Faunus, but Blake does hold some residual hatred towards the Schnees. And this brings back to what I said about last episode, that the White Fang and the Schnee Dust Company, they aren't actually mirrors of each other. In this specific situation, the feelings of Weiss and the feelings of Blake are conflicting, but even in this conversation, it's shown that they actually aren't. They aren't mirrors of one another, but given the circumstances of the dream, it does lead the conflict to actually start helping Weiss realize herself and her true feelings. During this fight, Weiss glimpses into her mind where she's looking at the original version of herself, and we see a moment of realization, like, what am I doing here? At that point, Blake takes the moment of advantage as Weiss is distracted and attacks. Weiss is able to dodge out of the way, but then we see the thorns of the nightmare curl around her again, snapping her back into her nightmare persona, and the same with Blake. And then Weiss realizes that Blake is possessed and will return her to normal to pass judgment on her, while Blake is also saying the same, that Nightmare Weiss is the one who deserves judgment. While this battle's going on, RWBY is also fighting against the nightmare, and she seems to be doing quite well against it, but she isn't able to actually land that final blow. No matter how much she cuts at the nightmare, she just can't seem to win. And she starts thinking about what Weiss had said to her, what the real Weiss had said to her when RWBY fell victim to her own dream, and starts pondering about why her weapon is actually backwards, when Weiss had said that everything has its reason. But before we actually get to see what that reason is, we get to see what's happening with Yang as she's struggling a little bit against Big Nicholas. The Colossal Titan then blasts Yang with the eye lasers and causes some damage to her. You know, those same lasers that Big Nicholas blasted the tiny Weisses with a short while ago? So this pretty much confirms that Big Nicholas did in fact hurt the tiny Weisses, so he deserves everything that's coming to him, because now that Yang has taken damage, you know exactly what that means. It's time for Yang to get fired up, as they say. You know, watching a little bit of fairy tale here and there, but, you know, Yang activates her semblance of burn, and the animation when she does so is, oh, it's so good. She activates her semblance, gets on to her bumblebee, and starts riding directly towards Big Nicholas, ready for the clash. As one of the fists comes hurtling towards her, Yang meets it and shatters it with her semblance. And then she rides up another arm of Big Nicholas, ready to deal that final blow. We see some dream actions take place as Yang's arm kind of grows in size along with her weapon. I guess similar to, if you've watched One Piece at all, Monkey D. Luffy and his rubber powers, but, you know, this is a dream abilities, and Yang is putting that to full use. She lets off one blow from her Ember Celica that flies towards the head of Big Nicholas and shatters it. But Yang's momentum on her bumblebee carries her forward into the open skull of Big Nicholas, and it is here that we see the true center of Weiss's dream, the core memory at the center of this kingdom, and a memory that is something that I've wanted to see for a very long time in the RWBY series. We see Weiss talking with her grandfather, the memory of her most likely happiest moment in her childhood. This is why Big Nicholas, or Nicholas Schnee, was so prominent in Weiss's dream, is because of how much she cherished her grandfather. This conversation is so important, not only for Weiss as a character and her motivations, but also, in a way, for the RWBY series as a whole, because this gives us a timeline of when Nicholas Schnee may have passed on. We always knew that Jock Schnee took over the Schnee Dust Company and kind of tossed Willow aside by the time that Weiss was 10 years old. But Weiss did indeed meet her grandfather and have these moments with him. Through this conversation, Weiss is telling her grandfather that people are saying that he built the Schnee family a castle, that people are already looking to her grandfather as a king, the king of Atlas. But Nicholas is saying that his true joy in life comes from serving others, and at some point Weiss may need to leave the household as well, to venture out on her own and build her own castle. She's a child at this point and says, "Oh, should I build one like you built the Schnee Manor?" And he tells her that she needs to build a castle within her heart, along with the friends that she will eventually meet. This is so impactful to everything that we've seen in Ice Queendom, and really Weiss's motivations as a whole, why she decided to eventually set out from the Schnee Manor, why she decided to leave Atlas in general. It is this moment that is at the core of it all, and I am just so happy that they included this. This moment, to me, is one of, if not the best in all of Ice Queendom. A lot of Ice Queendom has been about the symbolism and imagery, the meaning that things have for Weiss as an individual, and this moment is at the center of it all. And not only that, it shows us that Nicholas Schnee was the person who made Weiss not feel alone within her family. We've seen, and we will see again later in this episode, how alone Weiss felt in her family after her grandfather passed away, when it was just her, Whitley, Winter, Willow, and Jacques. We know that by the time of Weiss's 10th birthday, that is when Jacques told Willow that he only married her for the company. So at that point, Nicholas Schnee must certainly have passed away. And that's when, you know, Jacques was able to take control of the company, toss aside his family, and just focus on building his wealth and reputation. But Nicholas Schnee was alive for seemingly the first few years of Weiss's life, maybe until the age of 5 or 6, but I am just so happy that we got to see even just a single moment of Nicholas Schnee on screen. Honestly, I would love to see more of that in the RWBY series, but considering we're moving on from Atlas, I don't think we're actually going to get that being the case. But I'm really, really glad that we got to see that here. And to me, this moment is certainly canon. The entire series of Ice Queendom is pretty much confirmed to be non-canon by the events later shown in the episode, but there are certainly moments that I do consider 100% canon, and this is certainly one of them. This memory doesn't really last for long, though, as considering Yang was able to deal that finishing blow to Big Nicholas, the memory begins to fall apart, along with the giant titan in the center of the town. Luckily, Yang is able to escape through the eye socket of the titan, and then we see the finale of the fight between Jean and the Arma Gigas. He once again picks up the giant sword, but is struggling to be able to use it in a way where he could actually deal a blow against the Arma Gigas. But he is not alone. Pyrrha and the tiny Weisses use Weiss's semblance and the dust to help Jean lift the sword, making it lighter for him, and he is able to land that finishing blow against the Arma Gigas. The armor shatters, revealing the Jacques statue underneath, and then the Jacques statue explodes. We get a quick glimpse of Weiss's inner sanctum, and we're shown that Klein, the dock, was frozen. The flame is no longer lit, and the overall appearance of Jacques, that looming image, disappears. So by taking out the Arma Gigas, I think Jean inadvertently took out the influence of Jacques in Weiss's dream. Likely also with the influence of Blake's dream overtaking Weiss's dream, but still, the influence of Jacques is now gone. Not that it's really relevant to the overall episode, but it's still nice to see. And of course, after that stressful situation, they're all pretty relieved that the enemy they were facing is now vanquished. But they're not out of the woods yet, because the giant titan is crumbling away, and the parts of it are falling all over the kingdom, including very close to where they were standing. So they need to get the heck out of Dodge. And at the same time, Weiss and Blake are seeing the statue fall. And Weiss is, of course, shocked to see the image of her grandfather crumbling away. Blaming Blake for this, she is even more invested in the fight against her. But she won't be for long, as we see RWBY continuing the fight against the nightmare. She realizes that the massive nightmare that she's fighting isn't actually the real body of the nightmare. And she realizes that the real one must be somewhere else. So she starts attacking the chairs of the auditorium that she's in, and can't seem to figure out where it is. But then she remembers something that Weiss told her within her own dream. That the nightmare hides within the shadow of the one facing it. And so, RWBY attacks this nightmare again, creating an opening to the dress that resembles Weiss's heart, held by the nightmare. And the light of Weiss's heart shines upon RWBY, creating a shadow behind her, where the nightmare truly hides. And then RWBY is able to use her weapon and fire upon the nightmare. The entire time, the reason that RWBY's weapon was backwards is because Weiss was telling her to look behind her. That is where the true enemy lies, behind one's self. And that is quite symbolic, though I also wonder how Weiss knew that the nightmare would be hiding in the shadow, and how Xion didn't say anything about that when everyone jumped into the dream. Because being a nightmare hunter, Xion probably should have known that it will be hiding in the shadow of the person fighting against the nightmare, and that's how you truly defeat it. Wouldn't that be how, Pyrrha and the rest of Team Juniper were able to free Jean from the nightmare? By defeating the true version of the nightmare? You'd think. So, logically, some things don't exactly make sense here, but it's still very symbolic and, honestly, a wonderful scene overall. But immediately after RWBY takes out the real nightmare, the fake nightmare gets a hold of her, and she's unable to fight back. And this is when we get the one scene that I honestly didn't want to see in Ice Queendom. RWBY then activates her silver eyes to blast away the nightmare. And she doesn't immediately fall unconscious, because she's then able to use her weapon and fire a few shots against this fake nightmare to fully destroy it. And then she falls unconscious after that point. We see during the fight between Weiss and Blake that the thorns surrounding Weiss shatter. She is freed from the nightmare's hold, which also gives an opening to Blake to strike down Nightmare Weiss, and she is tossed to the ground. In the real world, the nightmare escapes from Weiss, being the exact same size as the nightmare that escaped from Jean. Xion is able to capture the Grimm in the same way that they did before, using their dream catcher and the electricity dust, and when they toss it into the little jar that they have, the nightmare disintegrates. It is completely destroyed, and Xion says that Team RWBY was able to completely vanquish the nightmare. So, does that mean Team Juniper wasn't able to completely vanquish the nightmare? I hope that something like this is going to be explained, why Jean's nightmare wasn't destroyed immediately, whereas Team RWBY's was, but I have a feeling with there only being one episode left, we're not going to get that explanation. I think it's kind of convenient then that, you know, Jean's nightmare survived, only for it to be later put into Blake, but, you know, I understand why the plot itself went in this direction. And then we get the utmost confirmation that Ice Queendom as a whole is non-canon, because Ozpin sees RWBY's eyes glowing beneath their covering. There is a silver glow around RWBY. Apparently Ozpin is the only one to see this, even though the other 4 people in the room, Xion, Pyrrha, Nora, Ren, they're all looking at the same group of 5 people laying on this massive dreamcatcher. I understand that Team Juniper, and Pyrrha in particular, is looking at Jean. She's very proud of his accomplishments, but you'd think maybe they'd see a silver glow coming from the eyes of one of their classmates, one of their friends, perhaps? But, you know, again, plot convenience. However, the fact that the silver eyes were used at all makes Ice Queendom non-canon. Because if RWBY was able to unlock her silver eyes before Volume 2, then there'd be no reason for her to not know about the silver eyes at this point. Unless it's just going to be very convenient that she fell unconscious in the dream and has no memory of it. Again, the same as what happened at the end of Volume 9, but really, this entire scene of RWBY using the silver eyes was completely fan service. I don't mind it as much as I thought it was, because it really wasn't that necessary for RWBY to do so in the overall plot. She was able to defeat the real nightmare without using the silver eyes. It was only against the fake nightmare that RWBY had to, because it was created by the nightmare. She was able to use the silver eyes against it. I really don't think it was necessarily a desperate enough situation where the silver eyes were to activate, considering that we know for a fact from Volume 6, Maria told RWBY that the silver eyes are the desire to protect life. That is why they activated when RWBY saw Pyrrha being killed. Here, however, it was RWBY alone, so I don't think that's a desperate enough situation, at least not equivalent to RWBY seeing Pyrrha die at the end of Volume 3, so, you know, doesn't exactly fit, but again, it's against the fake nightmare. I frankly think the fake nightmare should have disappeared right when the real nightmare was destroyed, because the fake was only created by the nightmare. That was the one thing that the nightmare created itself, was that fake version of the nightmare. So I think at least that should have disappeared when the real nightmare was destroyed, but still, again, the overall plot. But since Ozpin specifically saw the silver eyes activate, that makes no sense why he did not put out a call to maybe RWBY's father, or Crow, or possibly even take it upon himself to let RWBY know that this power awakened within her and start giving her maybe a couple extra lessons, some training to help her, you know, fight against the Grimm. You'd think that would be helpful for someone trying to become a huntress, specifically meant to fight against the Grimm, to have as much time as possible to train with this ability that is specifically an anti-Grimm ability. It is absolutely non-canon that RWBY activated her silver eyes at this point, because it would make zero sense otherwise. Still, though, it is meant to be a callback to the original series. It is meant to be fan service, and I honestly don't mind it as much as I thought I would. Still, I would have preferred if that never happened in the series to begin with, but overall, it doesn't really take away from the impact that this episode had, considering it was just against the fake and not, you know, the real thing. It wasn't necessary to kill the nightmare itself, so, you know, it wasn't really a Deus Ex Machina, it was just fan service. At this point, though, with Weiss's nightmare removed, Blake's nightmare is free to take over the dream world, and Oh boy, does it start to. Those purple flames that are consuming the kingdom begin to spread. Yang arrives to see Weiss was now unconscious, and Blake was standing over her. Elsewhere, Jean, Pyrrha, and the tiny Weisses seem to be cornered by the Nightmare's thorns as well, so things are still pretty desperate. We then get a dream sequence where the hearts of RWBY and Weiss are talking with one another. Weiss is revealing to RWBY how alone she felt within her own family. Even though she had a family of 5 with herself, her 2 siblings, and her parents, she felt incredibly alone. And RWBY asks Weiss to trust her, if she would allow RWBY to be her friend, which is a very touching scene, and also leads into Volume 2, where Team RWBY does seem to be a lot closer and more friendly with one another. This conversation, that statement by Weiss, when she said she was alone within her own family, definitively proves that Nicholas Schnee was the most important person in Weiss's life for her early childhood. That he was the only one who made her not feel alone. That he helped shape Weiss into who she is now. She may have lost her way a little bit with Jacques' teachings and the way that he raised her. That led to her becoming arrogant, but in her heart, she still holds her grandfather's words very close to herself. And this also reveals even more about the Schnee family as a whole, because Weiss still has memories of her grandfather, memories that are core to her very being. But Whitley, being her younger brother, was never old enough to have those memories with Nicholas Schnee, to see the kindness that the Schnee family was supposed to represent. Instead, Whitley only fell under the influence of Jacques, and that is incredibly telling of the Schnee family dynamic as it stands now. This episode itself, because of just the introduction of Nicholas Schnee and seeing all of these different things, is fantastic. But there's still more to happen yet in this episode. RWBY regains consciousness and sees the dress that symbolizes Weiss's heart floating in front of her. Since she just had that heart-to-heart talk with Weiss about Weiss accepting her as a friend, the dress sends RWBY to Weiss's side, in my mind symbolizing that her heart has accepted RWBY as a true friend. And when RWBY arrives at Weiss's side, she sees that Weiss has returned to herself. Of course, happy to see her. Weiss is confused as to what's happening. She has no memory of any of the nightmare up until this point, which also means she doesn't have any memory of those heart-to-heart conversations that she had with RWBY. And although she doesn't have the memory of it, I think the feelings did remain within Weiss. And that leads into Volume 2, where she does feel a lot more friendly to RWBY, a lot more trusting of her team, knowing that they are there for her, why she's no longer so fixated that she should have been on a team with Pyrrha, etc. But that's not really a concern for this moment, probably something going to be left for next episode, as right now, Weiss is just a bit confused as to where she is and why Blake looks so different. Yang informs both Weiss and RWBY that Blake is still possessed by the nightmare, and this actually upsets Weiss. She's mad at herself for not noticing that Blake had changed, that Blake had been attacked by the nightmare, the same way that RWBY was upset that she didn't notice Weiss being attacked by the nightmare, that she had changed. But RWBY and Yang kind of say that's not exactly how it is, and they need to do something about it. In fact, Xion is just going to wake Blake up, as we see the coin that Blake is holding start to glow. But she isn't able to wake up. Xion says in the real world that the nightmare has dug too deep into her heart, which I'm just gonna say, no shit, Sherlock. What did you think was going to happen? I said this during the last review when Xion had mentioned that, oh, because Blake accepted it willingly, she'll likely be able to resist it. No. When you accept something willingly, you are, by definition, not resisting it. So no kidding, the nightmare was able to quickly grasp a hold of Blake's heart. So, that's just basic logic. They would not be able to wake Blake up because she willingly accepted the nightmare. But she willingly accepted the nightmare into her body not her mind. And because of that, as Team RWBY fights against Nightmare Blake, Yang is able to land a blow against her and crack the mask over her face, revealing the true consciousness of Blake. Her mind is still whole beneath the hold of the Nightmare. And that is what is important, the separation of the mind and the body. The Nightmare is controlling the body, can't actually wake up, but her mind can still be in control. Yang tells Blake to wake up, and she moves her body to pull out the coin and try to activate it. But the light of the coin, the power of Xion's aura, fades from it. The Nightmare has too much of a hold on Blake, but she is able to break her consciousness out of it. Within her mind, she sees the vision of what she's become. She sees the image of Adam, and is able to break through it and break out of the Nightmare's shell. She reaches for Yang, and Yang pulls her out. A nice Bumblebee moment there for sure. And now it is all of Team RWBY against Nightmare Blake. This is exactly how I described that I wanted Ice Queendom to end in a video that I made a few weeks ago. That it would be all of Team RWBY against the Nightmare. The only difference is I thought it was going to be against Weiss's Nightmare, not Blake's, but still the same overall ending. All of them fight against Nightmare Blake, and they are able to defeat her. In fact, it is Blake who deals that finishing blow, fully casting aside that previous version of herself, essentially overcoming her inner demons and her nightmares. Now, obviously, her nightmares are going to come back to haunt her later on, given that Adam shows up at the end of Volume 3, the White Fang continues to cause problems, and, you know, everything leading up to what happened in Volume 6, but for now, she is putting the past behind her and trying to focus on the future. That's what she was trying to do when she left the White Fang, abandoned Adam, and she had hoped that it would never come back to bother her again. Obviously, she was wrong, but in this moment, mentally, she is moving past it. But, you know, it will come back to drag her down later on. And then all that remains is the Nightmare itself. All of Team RWBY fights against it, with RWBY being the one who knows how to defeat it. And that was thanks to Weiss showing her how to do so. They attack the Nightmare and make an opening to the symbol of Blake's heart, what the White Fang used to represent when it was under the control of her father. The light shines forth and all of their shadows combine into one. They all attack it and destroy the Nightmare. And upon doing so, the dream world begins to fade. They have won. Defeated both the nightmares that possessed Weiss and Blake. The dream has come to an end. In the real world, the Nightmare escapes from Blake's body the same as it had done with Weiss and Jean. Jean is able to capture it, put it into a jar, and we get no confirmation of if it was completely vanquished or not. So presumably it's still alive. What's different about this one nightmare that infected Jean and then Blake, and it's not actually destroyed, even though it was destroyed in the exact same way that Team RWBY destroyed Weiss's nightmare? Or was it specifically because RWBY defeated the fake nightmare that was still present within Weiss's dream, that was the residual of the nightmare, and for some reason by defeating that, that completely destroys all remnants of the nightmare? You'd think that would destroy the physical version flat out, instead of having the physical version pop out of Weiss and then be captured by Xion, only to put it into the jar and then it dies. Like, some things don't exactly track here, but overall, fantastic episode, and the animation that was shown during when, like, Yang activated her semblance, the fight against Nightmare Blake, and the Grim at the end, like, oh, everything was fantastic. Everyone is celebrating in the real world, and the people within the dream then all meet up. Weiss and the rest of Team RWBY find where Jean, Pyrrha, and the tiny Weisses are. And this is when Weiss finds out that this wasn't actually Blake's dream. It was her dream. That the tiny Weisses and Pyrrha were characters of her own nightmare, and that she called them sillies. And Weiss immediately becomes embarrassed and probably a little bit ashamed that she let herself fall victim to the nightmare, and she tries to tell everyone not to speak of this again. Specifically telling Jean not to tell the rest of his team, but, you know, a little bit late for that, considering that she's been under the influence of the nightmare for probably at least 24 hours at this point. Not exactly sure of the timeline, but it's not been a short time considering RWBY and the rest of her team have gone into the nightmare 3 times already. So she's a little bit upset by that. So when Yang uses that final coin to wake all of them up, the dream shatters. The kingdom is no more. And Weiss, upon opening her eyes, comes face to face with all of the witnesses who were watching her sleep. And also watching her be attacked by a Grimm, which obviously is a little bit embarrassing for her, and as we see at the end of the episode with Weiss hiding in her bed, it might take a little while for her to get over that embarrassment at the very least. This is still taking place like maybe a month into their first term at Beacon Academy, so there's 3 months for that to happen before we get to the events of Volume 2, which we will actually be starting with the finale of Ice Queendom. Episode 12 is titled The Best Day Ever, the same as the title of the first episode of Volume 2, meaning we're probably getting the food fight in next episode, which is going to be amazing to see. An excellent callback to the original RWBY series. And this is where the episode ends. Overall, a fantastic episode, and I think the best episode of Ice Queendom. An excellent payoff for all of the build-up, all of the symbolism and imagery, the things that we saw in Weiss's dream leading to this point, and centering around her grandfather, the words that her grandfather spoke, building a castle within her heart, and she did literally that, protecting all of the things that she held dear. Though, you know, the way that she went about doing so didn't exactly come across clearly, the symbolism within all of these different scenes and images are amazing. Having that scene between Weiss and her grandfather, a glimpse into Weiss's real childhood and the memories that she holds so dear, as well as seeing the beautiful animation of the entire series as a whole, but in particular this episode, seeing the fight against Nightmare Blake and the Grimm was fantastic. Not to mention we also got a few cute facial expressions of Weiss and her younger self at the same time, so, you know, overall an incredible episode. There are a couple of flaws with the episode, namely, the silver eyes were completely unnecessary and entirely fan service, a nice callback, but definitively makes the show non-canon. And considering that the nightmare is over at this point, Xion really didn't do much other than act as just a driving force of the plot. Without Xion, there would be no plot. The only reason that Xion is there is to facilitate the entry into dreams, and nothing more. I wish Xion did more in the series, and I wish that the nightmare in the real world also had more impact, because it was stated by Xion at the beginning of the series when the nightmare was first introduced that it latches on to an individual, burrows into their heart, and feeds off of their aura. It was specifically said that Jean's nightmare was small because his aura was underdeveloped. Weiss has a much more robust aura. The nightmare was feeding on her for much longer, weeks at that point, where it was only feeding on Jean for like a day or two. So the nightmare should have grown much larger, being able to multiply, because that's something that Xion also stated. It uses the individual as a breeding ground to multiply and create more versions of itself. I think the nightmare, when it escaped into the real world, should have either been larger in size, or maybe there would have been multiple nightmares. Like, I don't know, the one that was infecting RWBY that we never got any closure whether it was removed or not. I would have thought maybe if RWBY had killed the nightmare that was taking hold of Weiss, that it would have at least shown the little symbol on RWBY's palm disintegrate as well, that it was tied to that nightmare. I'm guessing that was the case, but it was never explicitly shown, so I really feel like that's a flaw unless they're going to show that at the beginning of episode 12, or at least mention it in some way, shape, or form. I hope that they do, because otherwise that's gonna be a pretty glaring plot hole. What happened to that nightmare? It was never explicitly said or shown. But those are topics that I will discuss after Ice Queendom ends. I've refrained from making a lot of separate videos on Ice Queendom because as one episode leads into the next, it's hard to predict what's to come later on. But there is still a lot I want to say about the events of Ice Queendom, the symbolism that it has, and there's going to be a number of videos coming afterwards. Whether it's canon, canon adjacent, and non-canon, as well as, many other things with specific instances within the plot. Overall, Ice Queendom has been an amazing series, and this episode was an excellent climax. Next episode, I think, is mostly going to be fan service, having the food fight animated. We'll see Xion go on their way, as well as maybe a resolution of sorts between Team RWBY and Team Juniper, that Weiss will get over her fixation on Pyrrha and fully accept her own team, and say that, you know, Jean and Team Juniper have a wonderful team as well. But that also brings up another couple of gripes I may have with this episode. Definitively now, Pyrrha did nothing in Weiss's dream. She was a great caretaker for the tiny Weisses, but given how highly Weiss viewed her in both combat capabilities, knowing that she's won multiple tournaments, and how just on a pedestal Pyrrha is in Weiss's mind, that really was not reflected in Ice Queendom, other than Pyrrha dressing similarly to Weiss and singing Mirror Mirror, Weiss's own song. But her combat abilities were not showcased whatsoever, and I think that is a huge missed opportunity, considering myself and likely many others in the RWBY fandom really wanted to see Pyrrha have one last moment to shine in Ice Queendom, considering she likely will not have any moments in the canon RWBY series outside of flashbacks. So I think that's a huge missed opportunity, and this also really doesn't fit with how Weiss treats Jean in Volume 2. She's very cold and very uncaring about him, even though she now knows how much effort he put forth to help save her, along with the rest of her team. So I feel like that's a bit of a disconnect. I guess you could argue that she's pushing him away because he now knows the inner portions of her heart and she doesn't want to even look at him. But then partway through Volume 2, when she realizes that Jean was the one who got Neptune to come talk to her at the dance, then she looks more fondly on him. Like, that pretty much definitively makes this non-canon, but I should probably keep all that for a separate video. Overall, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, how you enjoyed this episode, the moments that were showcased in it, the fight against Nightmare Blake, and the imagery, symbolism of the talk that Weiss had with her grandfather, the things that reveals about Weiss's past, the Schnee family as a whole, and how the Schnee family has developed to the point that it is. There is just so much to love and admire about this series as a whole, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, want to see more like it, make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next video.